Hi there, tonight we're taking a journey back in time. Not to grand ballrooms or bustling markets, but into the surprisingly intimate and often, let's be honest, quite grimy world of Victorian hygiene. Imagine yourself stepping off a time machine, the air thick with coal smoke and a symphony of unfamiliar smells, not all of them pleasant. You might notice the elaborate clothing, the grand architecture. But what about the things you can't see, the daily rituals of cleanliness, or lack thereof? You'd quickly realize that your modern sensibilities about a quick shower and a squirt of hand sanitizer simply wouldn't compute. In fact, you probably wouldn't survive a week without encountering something truly bewildering to your germ-conscious self. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a cobbled London street in the mid-19th century. The sheer volume of people, horses, and open drains creates an immediate assault on your senses. Your eyes might be drawn to the elegant ladies in their sweeping gowns or the stern-faced gentlemen in their top hats. But your nose tells a different story. A pervasive scent hangs heavy in the air. A complex bouquet of coal smoke, horse manure, uncollected refuse, and, subtly, human effluvia. This isn't just a fleeting whiff. It's a constant companion, a backdrop to every daily activity. You might wonder, how did anyone stand it? And more importantly, how did they try to keep themselves clean in such an environment? The Victorians, for all their outward appearance of strict morality and decorum, lived in a world where true cleanliness, as we understand it, was often an elusive ideal. While we might picture them as prim and proper, always spotless, the reality was a fascinating tapestry of evolving understanding and deeply ingrained habits. Consider the sheer effort involved in getting clean. There were no taps gushing hot water on demand. Water had to be fetched, heated over a fire, and then transported. This wasn't a quick 2-minute shower. It was a significant chore, often consuming hours for an entire household. This fundamental difference in access to basic resources fundamentally shaped their daily hygiene practices. Historians still argue whether the Victorian stuff era was a period of increasing cleanliness or simply increasing awareness of dirt. It's a bit of both, really. On one hand, you have the burgeoning public health movement, slowly but surely pushing for better sanitation. On the other, you have centuries of ingrained habits, limited scientific understanding, and a pervasive, almost inescapable level of grime that made personal cleanliness a constant battle. Imagine wearing layers of heavy wool clothing in the summer heat, with no easy way to wash them frequently. The concept of daily washing was far from universal, even among the more affluent. For many, a quick wipe with a damp cloth was the extent of their morning ablution. The idea of a full-body bath every day would have seemed not only impractical, but perhaps even unhealthy to some. You might chuckle at the thought of going days, or even weeks, without a proper wash, but for them, it was simply life. This era was a curious blend of emerging science and old superstitions, nowhere more evident than in their approach to keeping clean. The groundwork for our modern hygienic standards was certainly laid during this period, but it was a long, slow, and often very smelly process. As you continue your imaginary stroll through Victorian London, you might notice something peculiar about the perceived cleanliness of buildings versus people. Grand facades gleam, recently scrubbed, perhaps, but the air still carries that telltale tang of decay and human activity. This apparent contradiction hints at a fundamental misunderstanding of disease that permeated the era, the miasma theory. This wasn't just a quirky belief. It was the dominant scientific explanation for how illnesses spread. People genuinely believed that foul odors emanating from decaying organic matter, sewage, and stagnant water were the direct cause of disease. It was the bad air, the miasma, that made you sick, not invisible microscopic creatures. So, when you see a street cleaner diligently sweeping away horse manure, or a homeowner scrubbing their doorstep, they weren't necessarily thinking about germs. They were thinking about keeping the air around them sweet and palatable, believing that a pleasant smell equated to good health. If a street smelled bad, it was literally considered a breeding ground for sickness. This belief had profound implications for how public health was approached. Instead of focusing on clean water supplies or proper waste disposal, initial efforts often centered on simply ventilating buildings, airing out secret rooms, and trying to mask or eliminate offensive smells. You might even see people carrying small bouquets of flowers to ward off the noxious fumes they encountered. It's almost comical to think about, isn't it? Oh dear, the cholera is about, better sniff my posy. This pervasive belief meant that while a parlor might be meticulously dusted and polished, the drains just outside could be overflowing, and no one would necessarily connect the two as a direct health threat beyond the immediate stench. They'd probably blame the drain's smell rather than the raw sewage itself for any ensuing illness. It was a logical leap, in a way. If something smells bad, it must be bad for you. And to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong about the correlation. Places with bad smells often were unhealthy. Historians still argue whether the miasma theory, despite its scientific inaccuracy, inadvertently led to some positive sanitary reforms simply by motivating people to clean up visible and odorous filth. The desire to banish the stench often resulted in actions that, by happy coincidence, also reduced exposure to actual pathogens. Consider the common perception of a sick. You'd find windows flung wide open, even in winter, to air out the disease. Bedsheets might be changed regularly, not because of germ transmission, but to prevent the sick air from clinging to them. Doctors, too, operated under this principle, often relying on their sense of smell to diagnose ailments. A particular smell emanating from a patient might be seen as a direct indicator of their condition. The idea that something completely invisible and odorless could be the true culprit was truly revolutionary, and took a long time to gain traction against the entrenched miasma theory. It's hard to shake a belief that seems so intuitively correct. If you can smell it, it must be there, right? This fundamental misunderstanding meant that many valiant efforts to improve public health were like trying to bail out a leaky boat with a teacup while ignoring the gaping hole below the waterline. The Victorians were constantly battling the visible and perceivable aspects of filth, unaware of the insidious, unseen enemies lurking within. This misdirection, however, set the stage for later breakthroughs, as the sheer scale of the bad air problem eventually demanded more comprehensive, albeit still flawed, solutions. As you drift further into the past, past the pungent smells and the pervasive belief in miasma, you start to consider the very source of life, water. Today, you simply turn a tap and clean, potable water gushes forth. In Victorian times, it was a constant, often deadly, struggle. Imagine your daily routine beginning not with a refreshing glass from the fridge, but with a trek to a communal pump, a public well, or perhaps even a street vendor hawking water from a cart. And this water, once acquired, was far from pristine. The Victorian era was a time of rapid urbanization, with cities swelling beyond their infrastructure's capacity. Rivers like the Thames, once vital arteries, became open sewers. Raw sewage from houses, industrial waste from factories, and runoff from streets all poured directly into them. And then, downstream, the same river might be the source for drinking water for millions. You can probably already guess the horrifying implications. Cholera epidemics, typhus, and dysentery weren't just unfortunate occurrences. They were recurring nightmares, sweeping through populations with terrifying speed. People literally drank their own waste, often unknowingly. It's a truly chilling thought, isn't it? Knowing what we know now, it makes your stomach churn just thinking about it. Even if you managed to avoid direct river water, other sources weren't much better. Public pumps might draw from shallow wells contaminated by nearby overflowing cesspits or graveyards. Private wells in poorer areas were often even worse, dug haphazardly and without any consideration for sanitation. You might think, well, they could just boil it. And some certainly did, especially if they were aware of the risks or had access to the fuel to do so. But for the vast majority, particularly the working classes, boiling every drop of water for drinking and washing was an insurmountable task, both in terms of time and resources. This lack of clean water wasn't just a matter of convenience. It was a matter of life and death, shaping every aspect of daily hygiene. How do you wash yourself properly, or your clothes, when the very water you use carries disease? How do you cook safely when your ingredients are rinsed in contaminated liquid? Historians still argue whether the sheer scale of the water crisis was truly understood by ordinary Victorians, or if they simply accepted illness as an inevitable part of life. While medical professionals debated the miasma theory versus germ theory, the reality on the ground was that people were dying from preventable waterborne diseases in staggering numbers. The infamous Broad Street pump cholera outbreak, where Dr. John Snow famously linked the disease to a contaminated water source by removing the pump handle, was a groundbreaking moment. But it was just one battle in a much larger war against tainted water supplies. This was a world where a simple glass of water could be a death sentence, making every act of cleaning, however rudimentary, fraught with peril. It underscores just how fundamental clean water is to the very concept of hygiene. With the omnipresent threat of contaminated water looming, you might wonder who, if anyone, was trying to fix this incredibly dire situation. This is where the public health pioneers step onto our dimly lit historical stage, often battling against ingrained beliefs and immense societal inertia. These weren't necessarily glamorous figures, but dedicated individuals who slowly, painstakingly, began to connect the dots between filth, disease, and the well-being of the population. Imagine a forward-thinking doctor like Edwin Chadwick, not exactly a household name today, but a titan in his time. He was an English social reformer who in the 1840s published a groundbreaking report titled The Sanitary Condition of the Labouring Population of Great Britain. This wasn't some dry academic paper. It was a damning indictment of the appalling living conditions, the open sewers, the contaminated water, and the shocking rates of disease directly linked to them. Chadwick, a staunch advocate of the miasma theory, believed that cleaning up the filth would eliminate disease. While his underlying scientific premise was flawed, His advocacy for universal systems of drainage and clean water supply was revolutionary and ultimately correct in its outcome. He might have been wrong about why the filth caused disease, but he was absolutely right that it did. It's a bit like trying to fix a leaky roof by painting the walls. Wrong approach. But at least the house looks better, and maybe, just maybe, you notice the leak while you're up there. Then you have figures like Dr. John Snow, who we briefly touched upon. His work during the 1854 cholera outbreak in London's Soho district was a masterful piece of epidemiological detective work. While many clung to miasma, Snow meticulously mapped out the cholera cases, discovering a clustering around the Broad Street pump. By famously having the pump handle removed, he demonstrated a clear link between the contaminated water source and the spread of the disease. Even though the mechanism of germ transmission wasn't fully understood yet, his work was a powerful, empirical challenge to the prevailing miasma theory, laying crucial groundwork for the acceptance of germ theory later on. These pioneers faced immense resistance, vested interests, a lack of understanding, and the sheer cost of implementing large-scale infrastructure projects made their work incredibly difficult. Building sewers and clean water systems wasn't cheap, and convincing property owners and local authorities to invest in something they didn't fully comprehend was an uphill battle. Historians still argue whether the political will for large-scale sanitary reform came primarily from scientific evidence, or from the sheer terror of repeated cholera epidemics that threatened all social classes. It often took a major crisis, like the Great Stink of 1858, when the River Thames became so putrid that Parliament itself was almost uninhabitable, to truly galvanize action. These reformers weren't just about grand plans. They also championed smaller, but no less important, changes. They pushed for better ventilation in homes, advocated for the removal of refuse, and campaigned for public education on basic hygiene. They were the unsung heroes who began the monumental task of dragging Victorian society out of its self-made quagmire of filth and disease. Their efforts, though incremental at first, slowly but surely began to chip away at the vast public health problems of the era, paving the way for the cleaner, healthier cities we inhabit today. Without their relentless campaigning, the daily reality of Victorian life would have remained infinitely more perilous and unpleasant. Having explored the grand sweeping efforts of public health reformers, let's zoom in on a far more personal aspect of Victorian life: bathing habits. Today, the idea of a daily shower or bath is so ingrained, so automatic, you probably don't even think about it. But for the average Victorian, even for those with means, the concept of a regular full body wash was, well, foreign. Imagine your morning routine. You wake up in a chilly bedroom, perhaps in a grand townhouse, perhaps in a more modest dwelling. There's no gleaming porcelain shower stall awaiting you. Instead, you likely had what was known as a sponge bath or a washdown at your basin. A servant or a family member would bring up a jug of cold water and place it in a bowl on your washstand. Alongside it would be a flannel or sponge and a bar of, perhaps, rather harsh soap. Your task was then to wash the exposed parts of your body, face, neck, hands, and arms. Sometimes, more adventurous souls might tackle their armpits or groins, but a thorough scrub of your entire body was not the norm. It was a quick, functional splash, shandwipe, designed more to refresh and remove visible dirt than to truly cleanse. Why the reluctance to get fully wet? Several reasons. Firstly, the sheer logistics. As we've discussed, water had to be fetched, heated over a fire, and carried to the bedroom. It was laborious and time-consuming. Secondly, there was a prevailing belief, a carryover from earlier centuries, that excessive bathing, especially with hot water, could be detrimental to one's health. It was thought that hot water opened the pores, making one susceptible to chills and illness. You might even hear whispers that it weakened the constitution. So, a quick, cold sponge bath was seen as more invigorating and safer than a luxurious hot soak. It's almost comical, isn't it? The very thing we associate with health and relaxation, they saw as a potential danger, even for those who could afford the luxury of hot water and large tubs. Full baths were a rare event. For many in the middle and upper classes, a full bath might happen once a week or even once a fortnight. For some, it was a monthly occurrence. Think about that for a moment. Going weeks without fully immersing yourself in water. You'd certainly build up a certain patina. Historians still argue whether the Victorians were truly less clean than their predecessors, or if their growing awareness of dirt simply made them more conscious of their own uncleanliness. It seems to be a combination, as the burgeoning public health discourse started to make people think more critically about hygiene. Even if their practices lagged behind, the actual bathtubs themselves were often made of tin, copper, or zinc, sometimes painted to look like wood and portable. They might be kept in a dressing room or even just a bedroom and brought out when needed. There were no dedicated bathrooms with built-in tubs as we know them. The process involved filling the tub with hot water lugged from the kitchen, taking your quick dip, and then the equally arduous task of emptying and cleaning the tub. It wasn't a casual affair. It was an event. This gradual, reluctant adoption of more regular, though still infrequent, bathing rituals marks a slow shift in societal attitudes towards personal cleanliness, a small ripple in the vast ocean of Victorian grime. Moving up the social ladder a bit, from the general practices of infrequent bathing, you begin to observe how upper-class cleanliness started to diverge, largely due to the twin advantages of servants and rudimentary indoor plumbing. While the concept of a dedicated bathroom as we know it was still nascent, the wealthy certainly enjoyed a level of convenience that was unimaginable to the masses. Imagine yourself in a grand Victorian mansion. You might find a water closet, an early flush toilet tucked away on a landing or in a small windowless room, perhaps even one attached to a master bedroom. This was a true luxury, sparing residents the need for outdoor privies or chamber pots, though chamber pots were still very much in use for nighttime relief. The flush mechanism itself was often noisy and somewhat temperamental, sometimes requiring a significant volume of water that had to be hand-pumped to a cistern or drawn from a rooftop tank. So, while it was indoor, it wasn't quite the seamless experience you're used to. It's almost funny to think about a noisy, clanking machine as the height of modern convenience. More significantly, for personal hygiene, the presence of servants was a game changer. You didn't have to fetch your own water, heat it, or carry it. Your chambermaid or valet would bring pitchers of hot and cold water to your washstand, lay out your basin and soap, and even assist with pouring water over you. If you wished for a more thorough wash, this eliminated the sheer physical labor that deterred so many from more frequent washing. While full immersion baths were still not a daily ritual, they were certainly more common among the gentry, perhaps 2 or 3 times a week. Thanks to the dedicated efforts of household staff, servants would fill the portable bathtub, prepare the room, and then later empty and clean it. Beyond personal bathing, servants were crucial for maintaining the cleanliness of the household itself. Floors were scrubbed, Furniture was polished, and linens were laundered. This created an outward appearance of pristine cleanliness, even if the individuals living within might still only be topical washers. The dirt, in essence, was largely managed by an invisible army of domestic staff. Historians still argue whether the demand for cleaner homes among the upper classes drove the innovation in plumbing and sanitation, or if the innovations themselves simply made cleanliness more attainable for those who could afford it. It's likely a symbiotic relationship, with both factors pushing each other forward. Another subtle aspect of upper-class hygiene was the access to finer soaps, perfumes, and even early forms of deodorants, though these were more about masking odors than preventing them. Their clothing, though elaborate and layered, was also more likely to be made of finer materials like silk and linen, which could be, theoretically, easier to keep clean than heavy wools, if laundered frequently. However, the sheer volume and complexity of upper-class attire meant that garments might still go for extended periods between full washes, relying instead on brushing and airing out. So, while the upper echeled lived in a cleaner environment and had more hygienic potential, their personal habits still sometimes reflected the broader era's general reluctance for vigorous and frequent scrubbing. It shows that even with all the advantages, old habits, and perhaps old beliefs about the dangers of water died hard. Stepping away from the relative luxuries of the upper-class household, your gaze now turns to the vast majority of the Victorian population, the working classes. Here, water wisdom wasn't about convenience. It was about survival and ingenious adaptation. Imagine living in a cramped tenement, perhaps a single room shared by an entire family. Running water, or even a private well, was an unimaginable luxury. Your access to water for all purposes, drinking, cooking, and washing, likely came from a communal pump in the street or a shared standpipe in a yard. This wasn't just inconvenient. It was a daily struggle. Picture queues forming at dawn, buckets and pails clanking, as families waited their turn to fill their meager containers. The water itself was often of dubious quality, frequently drawn from sources dangerously close to cesspools or overflowing drains, as we've discussed. So, the wisdom wasn't about purity, but about careful rationing and multi-purpose use. The water used to rinse vegetables might then be used for a quick wash, and finally, for cleaning the floor. Every drop counted, and waste was unthinkable. It sounds utterly exhausting, doesn't it? Just to get a drink of water. Personal hygiene, in such conditions, was a matter of grim necessity rather than comfortable routine. A full body wash was an extremely rare event, often reserved for special occasions or when illness necessitated it. For daily cleanliness, it was the lick and a promise method, a quick wipe of the face and hands with a damp cloth, perhaps from the water left over from the morning's tea. Clothing, particularly outer garments, was worn for extended periods between washes. Imagine heavy, dark woolen clothes that could effectively hide dirt for weeks or even months at a time. The smell of stale sweat, coal dust, and general grime would have been a constant. If unnoticed, companion bathing, when it happened, often involved a shared tub, if one was even available, or a large basin, usually in the kitchen, near the fire for what little warmth it could offer. The water would be heated on the stove, and the entire family might take turns in the same bath water, usually starting with the cleanest members, often the youngest children, and progressing to the adults. You can just imagine the murky state of the water by the end. Historians still argue whether the working classes developed a higher tolerance for certain levels of grime. or if their constant exposure simply dulled their perception of it. It's likely a bit of both, born out of sheer necessity and a lack of alternatives. This communal reliance extended beyond water. Shared privies, outdoor toilets were common, serving multiple families, often poorly maintained and overflowing. Washing clothes was also a communal affair, often done in public washhouses, if available, or in shared yards with rudimentary washing tubs and lines. This constant interaction in close, often unsanitary, quarters meant that diseases could spread rapidly, far more effectively than any individual hygiene efforts could counteract. The working class experience of hygiene was a stark reminder that cleanliness wasn't just a personal choice. It was deeply intertwined with the social and economic realities of the era. As we delve deeper into the layers of Victorian hygiene, you encounter the starkest reality of all, the extreme conditions faced by the very poor. Here, any notion of cleanliness, even the basic water wisdom of the working class, often vanished. Entirely, poverty's harsh hygiene realities were not just about limited resources. They were about a brutal, unending struggle for mere survival that pushed personal hygiene to the absolute periphery of concern. Imagine yourself in the depths of a Victorian slum, perhaps in areas like St. Giles or Jacob's Island in London. The air itself feels heavy, not just with coal smoke, but with the unmistakable scent of human and animal waste, stagnant water, and decaying rubbish. Here, sanitation was virtually non-existent. Overcrowding was rampant, with multiple families, often crammed into single, dilapidated rooms, sometimes even sharing beds in shifts. In such conditions, privacy for personal washing was impossible, and the very act of getting clean seemed an absurd luxury. Water, already scarce for the working class, was even more so for the destitute. Access might mean waiting hours at a distant, often broken, pump, or relying on water collected from dubious sources, like puddles or overflow pipes. Boiling water for safety was a luxury they couldn't afford, both in terms of fuel and the time it would take away from eking out a living. Consequently, waterborne diseases like cholera and typhus disproportionately ravaged these communities, creating a grim cycle of sickness and death. You'd likely witness children with crusted eyes and skin ailments, a direct result of chronic lack of washing. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That simply being poor could mean being condemned to a life of perpetual grime and illness. Personal bathing was practically non-existent. For many, clothes were worn until they literally fell apart, accumulating layers of dirt, sweat, and whatever grime was picked up from their daily struggle. Washing clothes was an impossibility. There was no access to water, soap, or space, and certainly no time. The concept of clean clothes was a distant memory. This lack of change of clothing, combined with the absence of personal washing, meant that vermin like fleas and lice were ubiquitous, adding another layer to the misery. Historians still argue about the psychological toll this constant state of uncleanliness had on individuals, beyond the obvious physical health impacts. Was it a source of shame, or did it become so normalized that it ceased to register? Waste disposal was equally dire. Chamber pots, if available, were often emptied directly into the streets or into communal open drains, adding to the pervasive stench and disease vector. Rubbish simply accumulated in alleyways and courtyards, creating mountains of festering refuse. There were no municipal services to collect it in these areas. The very ground you walked on would be saturated with filth. The fight for survival. For the next meal, for a roof over one's head, utterly overshadowed any concern for personal or environmental cleanliness. The stark reality of poverty in Victorian times was a constant, inescapable state of filth, a world away from the pristine facades of the wealthier districts, and a chilling reminder of how deeply intertwined hygiene is with economic circumstance. Having considered the intimate realities of personal hygiene across social strata, let's widen our lens and step back onto the bustling, grimy streets. You've likely already noticed it, felt it, perhaps even tasted it. The city air, sooty breath. This wasn't just a minor annoyance. It was a fundamental, inescapable aspect of Victorian urban life, particularly in industrial centres. Imagine taking a deep breath in London or Manchester in, say, 1860. What fills your lungs isn't crisp, clean air, but a thick, particulate-laden concoction. The primary culprit: coal. Coal was the lifeblood of Victorian industry and domestic comfort. Factories belched endless plumes of black smoke from their towering chimneys, turning once blue skies into perpetual twilight. Every home, from grand manor to humble cottage, relied on coal fires for heating and cooking, adding their own contribution to the atmospheric soup. It was an era of unprecedented industrial growth, and the cost was quite literally in the air people breathed. You'd quickly find your clothes, your skin, your very hair coated in a fine layer of soot and grime. Windows had to be cleaned constantly, and even then, a faint film of black dust would quickly reappear. Imagine the effort involved in trying to keep white linens white. It was a losing battle. This wasn't just about aesthetics. The constant inhalation of these particulates led to widespread respiratory illnesses. London fog wasn't romantic. It was often a dense, acrid mixture of industrial smoke and natural mist, leading to smog events that could be deadly, reducing visibility to mere feet and causing severe breathing difficulties. It's almost unbelievable to consider that a major city could be regularly blanketed in such hazardous air. This pervasive air pollution had direct implications for hygiene. How do you feel truly clean when every surface, including your own body, is constantly being dusted with industrial fallout? Your morning sponge bath might wash away some visible grime, but the microscopic particles would cling to everything. The elaborate hairstyles, which we'll discuss later, were also excellent traps for this airborne dirt. You might find yourself constantly wiping your nose, and a cough would be a familiar companion. Historians still argue about the precise mortality rates directly attributable to air pollution alone, separate from other sanitary issues. But its contribution to widespread lung disease was undeniable. Beyond the smoke, the city air was also a carrier of myriad other unsavory elements. The dust from unpaved roads, laden with horse manure and general detritus, was constantly churned up by passing carriages and pedestrians. In warmer months, this dust could become a vector for disease, carrying dried pathogens. Even the simple act of existing outdoors meant a constant accumulation of dirt. The picturesque images of Victorian street scenes often omit the gritty, suffocating reality of the air that filled every corner, every alleyway, making every breath a testament to the era's unique brand of urban cleanliness. The concept of fresh air, as we know it, was simply not a daily reality for millions. Building on the notion of sooty air, let's confront perhaps the most undeniable and frankly unavoidable aspect of Victorian urban life: the pervasive urban stench. This wasn't just a fleeting bad smell. It was a constant, all-encompassing sensory experience that defined daily existence in crowded Victorian cities. You wouldn't just smell it. It would seep into your clothes, cling to your hair, and permeate the very fabric of your home. Imagine a sensory assault. Your nose is immediately overwhelmed by a complex, foul bouquet. Dominating this unpleasant mixture would be the sharp, acrid temps of raw sewage. With inadequate drainage and widespread use of cesspits and privies, human waste often seeped into the ground, flowed in open gutters, or was simply emptied directly into rivers and ditches. The Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames became so putrid that Parliament literally couldn't function, was just the most infamous example of a daily reality for millions. It sounds like something out of a horror story, doesn't it? A whole city, choked by its own waste. Intermingled with the sewage was the heavy, earthy smell of horse manure. Horses were the primary mode of transport, and their droppings littered every street, quickly turning to pungent dust in dry weather or slimy muck in the wet. Add to this the smell of decaying refuse. Without organized waste collection in many areas, food scraps, ash, and general household rubbish were simply piled in alleyways, backyards, or even directly onto the street, left to rot and attract vermin. You might also catch the metallic tang of industrial byproducts from factories, the stale reek of overcrowded, unventilated tenements, and the faint, unsettling scent of illness from sick rooms. This constant bombardment of foul odors was more than just unpleasant. It was considered, under the miasma theory, to be literally deadly. People believed that bad air caused disease, so the very air they breathed was seen as a source of contagion. This motivated some efforts at cleaning, but often through superficial means like whitewashing buildings or scattering disinfectants like chloride of lime, which themselves had strong, unpleasant smells. It was a vicious cycle. Try to cover one bad smell with another. Historians still argue whether the Victorians simply became desensitized to these powerful odors, or if they constantly suffered from them but had no effective means of escape or remediation. The irony is that while they feared the smell, they often missed the true culprits, the microscopic germs thriving in the very sources of those odors. You could scrub your parlor floor until it gleamed, but if the drains outside were choked with sewage, the invisible enemies were still lurking. This pervasive stench wasn't just a byproduct of city life. It was an active participant in shaping it, influencing daily routines, leisure activities, and even social interactions. Trying to hold a genteel conversation while the air around you was thick with such aromas must have been a unique challenge. Your sensitive modern nose would find the Victorian city an utterly overwhelming and unforgettable olfactory experience. As you continue to navigate this odoriferous Victorian landscape, your attention inevitably turns to the most critical resource of all: water, scarce and suspect. We've touched upon it before, but let's truly grasp the relentless, often terrifying, struggle for clean, accessible water that defined daily existence for most Victorians. This wasn't merely an inconvenience. It was a constant threat to health and life itself. Imagine your household's daily water supply. You didn't just turn on a tap. For many, especially in densely populated urban areas, water came from shed standpipes in the street or communal pumps. These were often active for only a few hours a day, leading to long queues and frantic rushes to fill every available bucket, jug, and barrel. This meant careful rationing was essential. The same bucket of water might be used for washing clothes, then for a quick sponge bath, then perhaps for scrubbing the floor. Every drop was precious, and multi-purpose use was the norm. It's a far cry from our endless supply, isn't it? makes you think twice about leaving the faucet running. The quality of this water was, to put it mildly, appalling. Rivers like the Thames, which served as a primary source for London's water companies, were simultaneously used as giant open sewers, receiving the untreated waste of millions. Industrial effluents, animal carcasses, and human excrement all flowed freely into the same waterways from which drinking water was drawn. Private wells, especially in poorer neighborhoods, were often sunk too close to overflowing cesspits, leading to severe contamination. Historians still argue about the precise moment public awareness of this direct link between sewage and drinking water truly became widespread. But the evidence was certainly mounting. It wasn't just the visible filth that was concerning, it was the invisible enemy. Microbes, though not yet understood, thrived in this polluted environment. While the prevailing miasma theory blamed foul smells for disease, the true culprits, bacteria causing cholera, typhus, and dysentery, were silently flourishing in the water supply. The sheer volume of deaths from these waterborne diseases was staggering. Epidemics were not isolated incidents, but regular, devastating occurrences that swept through cities, often hitting the poorest, who had the least access to safe water. The hardest, the struggle for clean water, led to desperate measures. Some wealthier households paid for filtered water delivered by carts, though the filters themselves weren't always effective. Others might try to boil water, but this required fuel and time, luxuries not everyone possessed. The stark reality was that for many Victorians, every sip of water, every wash, every meal prepared with it, carried a silent, invisible risk. This constant battle for a fundamental resource shaped not just their hygiene practices, but their very survival, making the fight for clean water one of the most critical public health challenges of the entire era. The desire for a pure, untainted source was, for many, nothing short of a dream. You've witnessed the pervasive stench, the sooty air, and the dangerously suspect water. It begs the question, if the very environment was so unsanitary and diseases were rampant, how long did it take for people to figure out the real reason for illness? This brings us to a pivotal shift in scientific understanding. Germ theories slow dawn. For centuries, as we've discussed, the dominant belief was the miasma theory, that foul smells from decaying matter caused disease. It was intuitive, it was tangible, and it was deeply ingrained. Imagine being a doctor in the early Victorian era, confronted with a patient suffering from cholera. You'd likely advise them to air out their room, perhaps burn some aromatic herbs to purify the air, or even prescribe a change of scenery to escape the bad odors. The idea that tiny, invisible creatures, too small to be seen by the naked eye, could invade the body and cause such devastating illness was almost fantastical. It defied common sense for many. You might chuckle now, thinking about doctors wafting flowers to fight an invisible enemy. But for them, it was cutting-edge science. The seeds of germ theory, however, were slowly being planted. Early microscopists, like Antony van Leeuwen, centuries before, had glimpsed what he called animalcules, but their significance wasn't understood. In the Victorian era, figures like Louis Pasteur in France began conducting groundbreaking experiments in the 1860s. He demonstrated that fermentation and spoilage were caused by the growth of microorganisms, and that these organisms could be destroyed by heat, a process we now call pasteurization. His work provided strong evidence that life did not spontaneously generate from non-living matter, and that tiny, airborne entities were responsible for decay. This was a massive blow to the prevailing scientific orthodoxy. including the miasma theory. Around the same time, Robert Koch in Germany began to meticulously identify the specific bacteria responsible for diseases like anthrax and tuberculosis. He developed a set of postulates, still used today, to prove that a particular microorganism causes a particular disease. His meticulous lab work provided the irrefutable evidence that Pasteur's abstract concepts needed to truly take hold in the medical community. Yet, even with these towering figures presenting compelling evidence, acceptance wasn't immediate or universal. Old habits and beliefs die hard, especially when they're tied to intuition. Historians still argue whether the medical establishment resisted germ theory due to genuine skepticism or institutional inertia, or perhaps a combination of both. The adoption of germ theory wasn't a sudden eureka moment for the general public either. For decades, it existed alongside, and often in conflict with, the miasma theory. Public health efforts might embrace both approaches, trying to clean up visible filth and advocating for hand washing. It was a gradual shift, influenced by scientific breakthroughs, devastating epidemics, and the persistent work of public health reformers. The understanding that tiny, unseen agents were the true culprits behind disease completely revolutionized sanitation, medicine, and personal hygiene. It moved the focus from simply masking smells to actively eliminating pathogens, fundamentally changing how societies approached cleanliness and health, and eventually leading to the sparkling clean bathrooms and safe drinking water you enjoy today. Having explored the monumental shift from miasma to germ theory, let's pivot to something far more tangible and, frankly, quite satisfying: soap, the everyday hero. Today, you probably have an array of soaps in your bathroom: liquid hand soap, body wash, perhaps even a specialty facial cleanser. In the Victorian era, soap was a much simpler, yet profoundly important, commodity, often with a far less luxurious feel. Imagine the typical bar of soap available to most Victorians. It wasn't the brightly colored, sweetly scented, mass product you pick up at the supermarket. Early soaps were often quite crude, made from a combination of animal fat, tallow, and lye, a strong alkaline solution, often derived from wood ash. The process of making soap, whether commercially or at home, was often a rather smelly affair. These lye-based soaps could be harsh, drying to the skin, and certainly not something you'd consider gentle. You might even find small bits of impurities still embedded within the bar. It's a far cry from your moisturizing, pH-balanced washes, isn't it? Makes you appreciate modern skincare, despite its often unglamorous nature. Soap was the frontline defense against visible dirt and grime. For the working classes, a simple bar of brown, unscented common soap was indispensable for laundry and for any personal washing that did occur. It was strong enough to cut through layers of accumulated dirt on clothing and on skin. The scarcity of clean water and the sheer effort required for washing meant that when soap was used, it was used with purpose to tackle significant grime. Historians still argue about the precise moment when soap transitioned from primarily a laundry, an industrial cleaner, to a widespread personal hygiene product. It seems to be a gradual shift, accelerated by public health campaigns and the increasing availability of mass-produced bars. For those with more means, finer, often imported, soaps began to appear. These might be made with better quality fats, perhaps scented with essential oils like lavender or rose, and molded into more appealing shapes. These became a subtle mark of refinement and cleanliness, a luxury item that signified a certain social standing. While French soaps might promise. A delicate fragrance, even these were often quite basic by modern standards. The idea of adding moisturizers or special skincare ingredients was still a long way off. The significance of soap, crude or refined, cannot be overstated. It was the primary tool for physical cleanliness, the agent that lifted dirt, grease, and to some extent odors, even before germ theory was fully understood. The act of scrubbing with soap and water undoubtedly removed a significant amount of the unseen pathogens that cause disease. So, while Victorians might have used it less frequently than we do, and their soap might have been harsher, it was nevertheless the unsung hero that allowed for at least some degree of physical cleanliness in a world overwhelmed by dirt. It was the simple, essential barrier between pervasive filth and attempts at a more hygienic existence. From the humble, often harsh, beginnings of common soap, we ascend into a more refined realm where cleanliness began to intertwine with status. This is the story of soap's scented status symbol. While basic Lantallow soap was a practical necessity for everyone, beautifully crafted, perfumed soaps emerged as a subtle, yet powerful, indicator of social standing and refinement in Victorian society. Imagine stepping into a high-end apothecary or a department store in the bustling centers of London or Paris. Amidst patent medicines and cosmetic curiosities, you would find an array of exquisitely wrapped soaps. These weren't just for cleaning, they were for display. They would often be molded into delicate shapes, embossed with elegant designs, and most importantly, infused with fragrant essential oils. Think of scents like rose, lavender, violet, or even more exotic blends, a stark contrast to the animal fat and lye smell of common soap. It's almost a complete sensory reversal, isn't it? From the pervasive stench of the city to the delicate perfume of a single soap bar. Owning and using such perfumed soaps signaled several things. Firstly, it indicated affluence. The finest ingredients and the intricate manufacturing processes made these soaps considerably more expensive than their utilitarian counterparts. Secondly, it suggested a concern for personal refinement and a desire to mask the less pleasant bodily odors that were a common reality in a less frequently bathed world. While heavy perfumes were used to overtly mask smells, a subtly scented soap offered a more genteel approach to personal freshness, hinting at a natural cleanliness rather than a desperate cover-up. Historians still argue whether the Victorians genuinely believed scented soaps offered a deeper clean, or if their primary function was purely aesthetic and social. It seems likely the latter, with a dash of aspirational thinking. These luxury soaps were often imported from France or Italy, adding to their allure and prestige. They might be presented as gifts or carefully displayed in private dressing rooms, hinting at a daily routine of delicate ablutions, even if the reality was still a quick splash. The advertising of the era began to play on these aspirations, featuring images of rosy-cheeked women with impossibly soft skin, all thanks to a particular brand of scented soap. You might see ads promising a youthful complexion or a delicate bloom, a far cry from the utilitarian promises of bulk laundry soap. The rise of these scented status symbols reflects a growing consciousness around personal appearance and the desire to differentiate oneself from the grimy masses. It marked a psychological shift, where cleanliness wasn't just about health, though that was slowly gaining ground, but also about respectability and social mobility. While the working class focused on cleanliness out of sheer necessity and the need to remove visible grime, the upper classes increasingly pursued it as an aesthetic and social statement. The humble bar of soap, once a simple cleanser, had now elevated itself to a perfumed emblem of Victorian elegance, smelling rather lovely even if your full bath was still a week away. Beyond the realm of traditional soap, you might be surprised to learn about the unsung hero in many a Victorian household, baking soda's versatile power. Today, you probably have a box of it in your fridge to absorb odors, or perhaps you use it for baking. But in the 19th century, this humble white powder was a true workhorse, a multi-purpose cleaner and freshener that found its way into surprisingly diverse aspects of Victorian hygiene. From the most personal to the domestic, imagine your Victorian counterpart reaching for a simple tin or paper packet of bicarbonate of soda. What could they do with it? Quite a lot, actually. For personal hygiene, it was sometimes used as a rudimentary dentifrice, a tooth powder, before the widespread availability of commercial toothpastes and brushes. A little baking soda on a cloth or finger could provide a gentle abrasive to clean teeth and help neutralize mouth odors. It wasn't exactly a pleasant, minty fresh experience, but it was certainly better than nothing and less harsh than some other abrasive powders available. You might even find it mixed with a little water to form a mouthwash, offering a brief respite from lingering smells. It's funny to think that something you bake cakes with was also cleaning teeth. Domestically, baking soda truly shone. It was a common ingredient in homemade cleaning solutions for various surfaces. For example, it could be sprinkled on carpets to absorb odors before sweeping, a sort of proto-carpet freshener. It was mixed with water to scrub greasy pots and pans, its mild, abrasive quality helping to cut through the grime. For sour-smelling drains or chamber pots, a sprinkle of baking soda followed by a little vinegar, another common household staple, would create a fizzing reaction, offering a primitive form of deodorizing and mild cleaning. Historians still argue whether the Victorians fully understood the chemical reactions behind baking soda's effectiveness, or if its use was more based on trial-and-error observations of its cleaning and deodorizing properties. It seems likely that practical results often preceded scientific understanding. Beyond cleaning, baking soda also had medicinal and cosmetic applications. It was used as an antacid for upset stomachs, and sometimes incorporated into bathing powders or foot soaks, to soften water or soothe skin. For tackling persistent body odor, a small dusting under the arms was not unheard of, acting as an early, albeit primitive, deodorant by neutralizing acidic sweat. This widespread reliance on a single, inexpensive substance highlights the Victorian ingenuity born of necessity. In an era before a vast array of specialized cleaning products, householders relied on basic, versatile ingredients. Baking soda, easily acquired and remarkably effective for its time, became an indispensable tool in the endless battle against dirt, grime, and odor, illustrating how even simple compounds played a vital role in navigating the complex world of Victorian cleanliness. It's a reminder that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most enduring. Having explored the versatile virtues of baking soda, let's now turn our attention to an area of hygiene that might make your modern teeth ache just thinking about it: dental care, crude beginnings. Today, you probably brush your teeth twice a day with a fluoride toothpaste, maybe floss, and visit your dentist for regular checkups. In the Victorian era, oral hygiene was a far more basic and often painful affair, with preventative care being almost non-existent for the majority. Imagine the typical morning routine. There was no soft bristled nylon toothbrush awaiting you. Instead, if you bothered with oral cleaning at all, you might use a piece of rough cloth or a finger to rub your teeth. For an abrasive, You might use plain salt, charcoal powder, or a homemade mixture of baking soda, brick dust, or even cuttlefish bone. These were often harsh, designed more to scrape off visible grime than to gently clean. The concept of enamel, protection, or gum health was simply not understood. You might even find yourself wincing at the thought of scrubbing your gums with such materials. It sounds more like a punishment than a cleaning ritual, doesn't it? Commercial tooth powders did begin to appear, often sold in small tins or jars. These might contain a mix of chalk, powdered cuttlefish, or charcoal, sometimes flavored with cinnamon or peppermint to mask the less appealing base ingredients. The toothbrush itself was a primitive affair, often a hog bristle brush, which could be quite stiff and abrasive, or even just a chew stick. These brushes were not disposable, making them a potential breeding ground for bacteria. Though the concept of bacteria was, of course, still nascent in the public consciousness, for many Victorians, especially the working classes and the poor, dental care was reactive, not preventative. Teeth were simply allowed to decay until they became unbearable. Then, the only solution was extraction. Imagine visiting a barber surgeon or an itinerant tooth drawer, who would yank out the offending tooth with formidable, unsterilized pliers, often without any anesthetic more potent than a strong drink. The pain must have been excruciating, and the risk of infection high. Historians still argue whether the widespread consumption of sugar, which became more affordable during the Victorian era, directly led to a significant increase in dental decay compared to earlier periods. It certainly contributed to the problem, making toothache a ubiquitous complaint, even among the affluent, who might visit a dentist regularly. The procedures were often crude. Fillings, if done, might be with gold or amalgam, but the techniques were rudimentary, and pain management was minimal. False teeth, or dentures, existed, but they were often ill-fitting and made from materials like vulcanite, a type of hardened rubber, or even human. Teeth scavenged from battlefields or extracted from the poor. The idea of sparkling white teeth for cosmetic reasons was also less prevalent. Functionality was the primary concern. So, while your ancestors might have dressed impeccably, smiled politely, and perhaps even smelled faintly of lavender, their dental hygiene was likely a landscape of pain, decay, and rudimentary solutions. From the rough world of tooth powders and extractions, let's turn to an innovation that, while initially a medical marvel, eventually trickled down to influence everyday personal hygiene. Listerine, an antiseptic's debut. Today, you probably know Listerine as a mouthwash, perhaps a fiery green or blue liquid that leaves your mouth feeling zingy. Its origins, however, are far more serious and deeply rooted in the Victorian struggle against unseen germs. Imagine the medical landscape of the mid-19th century. Doctors, as we've discussed, were slowly grappling with the emerging concept of germ theory. Operations were performed in unsanitary conditions, and post-operative infections were rampant, often proving more deadly than the initial ailment. Enter Joseph Lister, a British surgeon who, influenced by Louis Pasteur's work on microorganisms, pioneered the use of antiseptics in surgery in the 1860s. He used carbolic acid phenol to sterilize surgical instruments, wounds, and even spray the air in operating theaters. His methods dramatically reduced infection rates and saved countless lives, revolutionizing surgery. He was, quite literally, a lifesaver, though the smell of carbolic acid was famously, well, unpleasant. Now, where does Listerine come in? In 1879, An American doctor and chemist named Joseph Lawrence developed an alcohol-based antiseptic formula. He named it Listerine in honor of Joseph Lister's groundbreaking work. Lawrence initially marketed Listerine for surgical use, much like Lister's carbolic acid, as a powerful antiseptic for hospitals and doctors to clean wounds and sterilize equipment. It was touted for its germ-killing properties, a revolutionary concept for the time. You can almost picture the early advertisements. Kill the invisible demons. It's a stark contrast to the fresh breath promises of today, isn't it? However, the journey from operating theatre to bathroom cabinet wasn't immediate. Listerine, like many other early antiseptic products, was initially seen as a multi-purpose cleaner and disinfectant. It was marketed for everything from cleaning floors to treating gonorrhea, from preventing dandruff to curing colds. Its application as a mouthwash was a later, brilliant stroke of marketing. It wasn't until the early 20th century that the company pivoted its marketing to focus heavily on halitosis, a term they effectively popularized, convincing the public that bad breath was a medical condition that only Listerine could cure. This marked a significant shift, transforming a surgical antiseptic into an everyday hygiene product. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of products like Listerine truly improved oral health or primarily served as a cosmetic solution to mask odors. While modern Listerine certainly has antiseptic properties, its original formulation and the very concept of its widespread use by the public highlights a growing awareness of the invisible world of germs, even as people struggled with the physical realities of Victorian living. It's a fascinating example of how scientific breakthroughs, once confined to the operating room, slowly and sometimes circuitously made their way into the daily routines of ordinary people, changing the face of personal cleanliness forever, one gargle at a time. Having explored the surprisingly potent history of mouthwashes, let's move upwards to another often overlooked aspect of Victorian personal care: hair washing, eggs, and vinegar. Today, you probably have a shampoo and conditioner specifically formulated for your hair type, used perhaps daily or every other day. For Victorians, hair care was a far more infrequent and, to our modern sensibilities, rather unconventional affair. Imagine preparing to wash your hair in the mid-19th century. There was no shampoo as we know it on the market. The term itself didn't even become common until the late Victorian era, and then it referred more to a gentle massage of the scalp than a liquid cleanser. For most, hair washing was an infrequent event, often happening only once a month or even less. Why so seldom? Firstly, logistics. Heating enough water and performing a thorough hair wash was laborious. Secondly, similar to general bathing, there was a belief among some that washing hair too often would strip it of its natural oils, making it dry and brittle, or even causing colds by opening up the scalp's pores. You might even hear warnings that frequent washing could lead to hair loss. It's almost amusing, isn't it, to think that the very act of washing was considered risky. So, what did they use when they did wash their hair? Common methods involved simple household ingredients. For those with access, a diluted solution of borax was sometimes used, believed to cleanse the scalp. For others, particularly in rural areas or among the less affluent, eggs were a surprisingly common ingredient. Egg yolks, rich in fat and protein, could act as a gentle cleanser and conditioner, leaving hair soft and shiny. Imagine cracking an egg directly onto your hair, mixing it with a little warm water and working it into a lather, or rather, a viscous coating. It certainly sounds messy, doesn't it? After an egg wash, or indeed any wash, a rinse with diluted vinegar was popular. Vinegar, being acidic, would help to cut through any soap residue, balance the scalp's pH, and leave the hair with a characteristic shine. It was also believed to ward off lice and other parasites, a constant concern in an era of infrequent washing. For those who didn't want to get their hair fully wet, or between washes, a popular method was to rub brandy or rum into the scalp, believed to cleanse and stimulate. This would undoubtedly have left a lingering, if perhaps more pleasant, aroma than unwashed hair. Historians still argue whether these homemade remedies were genuinely effective at cleansing or primarily served to condition and mask odors. But they were certainly the best options available, given the infrequent washing. Daily hair care often revolved around brushing. Vigorous brushing was believed to stimulate the scalp, distribute natural oils, and remove loose dirt and dust. Ladies often spent significant time brushing their long hair, often with boar bristle brushes. This was a crucial ritual, far more common than any form of wet washing. So, while your modern routine might involve a quick lather and rinse, your Victorian counterpart was likely embracing the power of eggs, vinegar, and a good, solid brush to keep their elaborate tresses looking presentable. Following our journey into the realm of egg and vinegar hair washes, let's consider how these infrequent cleaning rituals collided with one of the defining features of Victorian femininity: elaborate hairstyles, hidden dirt. Today, a quick blow dry and a dab of product might suffice. For Victorian women, however, hair was often long, voluminous, and meticulously styled into intricate arrangements that, while beautiful, presented a logistical nightmare for proper cleaning. Imagine the typical Victorian lady's hairstyle. It wasn't about loose, flowing locks. Instead, hair was typically grown very long, then elaborately braided, coiled, pinned, and piled high on the head, often with the help of hairpieces, rats, pads made of hair or felt, and wires to create impressive volume. Think chignons, elaborate updos, and cascades of curls. These complex constructions could take hours to create, often with the assistance of a maid, and were designed to stay in place for days, sometimes even a week or more, between major restylings. It's almost mind-boggling, isn't it, the effort involved just to keep your hair up. The very nature of these intricate styles made frequent washing practically impossible. Disassembling such a coiffure, washing the hair, drying it, which without modern hairdryers could take hours or even a full day for very long hair, and then painstakingly restyling it, was an enormous undertaking. Consequently, hair was washed infrequently, perhaps once a fortnight, or even once a month, as we discussed. This meant that dirt, dust, and the ever-present soot from the city air would accumulate within the layers and folds of the hairstyle. The oils from the scalp, along with product residue like pomades or perfumed oils, would also build up. To manage this hidden dirt, ladies relied heavily on dry cleaning methods. Brushing, as mentioned before, was paramount. Long, vigorous brushing with stiff bristle brushes was meant to remove loose dirt and distribute scalp oils. Hair powders, often scented and sometimes tinted to match hair color, were also used. These powders, made from ingredients like starch or orris root, would absorb excess oil and help to freshen the hair, providing a temporary sense of cleanliness and a more pleasant scent. It was a bit like an early form of dry shampoo, designed to mask rather than truly cleanse. Historians still argue whether the aesthetic demands of these hairstyles inadvertently perpetuated less frequent washing, or if the infrequent washing simply necessitated these elaborate, dirt-trapping styles. It was likely a symbiotic relationship, each reinforcing the other. The concern wasn't just about visible dirt. In an era where head lice were a common problem, especially among children and in crowded environments, elaborate hairstyles provided ample hiding places. While specific remedies existed, preventing infestation was a constant challenge. So, while you might admire the elegant coiffures in Victorian portraits, beneath the surface lay a reality where beauty often came at the cost of genuine cleanliness, where hidden dirt was an unspoken compromise for the sake of elaborate fashion. Leaving the intricate world of elaborate Victorian hairstyles, let's peel back another layer, quite literally, and delve into the fascinating, if sometimes overlooked, realm of underwear, layers of linen. Today, your underwear is probably a simple, breathable layer, changed daily. In the Victorian era, undergarments were far more complex, multi-layered, and played a surprisingly significant role in overall personal cleanliness, particularly by protecting outer clothing from body grime. Imagine dressing for a typical Victorian day, especially if you were a woman. You wouldn't just put on a single layer of underpants. Oh no, the process was far more involved. You might start with a chemise, a loose-fitting, simple white cotton or linen shift worn closest to the skin. Over this would go corsets, then perhaps a corset cover to smooth the lines, and then several layers of petticoats, often starched and flounced, to give shape to the outer skirts. And yes, under all of this, women did wear drawers or knickers, though these were often open-crotched, a design that provided convenience for answering nature's call without completely undressing. But perhaps wasn't the pinnacle of hygiene. It sounds like an awful lot of fabric just to start your day, doesn't it? Makes your modern, minimalist undies seem revolutionary. For men, the layers were fewer, but still significant. A shirt often called a vest or undershirt and drawers. These two were typically made of cotton or linen. The crucial role of all these undergarments was to absorb sweat and body oils, acting as a barrier between the body and the outer clothing. Remember how infrequently outer garments were washed. This made the underlayers absolutely critical. They were the primary recipients of daily grime, designed to be changed and washed far more frequently than the expensive, elaborate outer dresses and suits. This leads to the intriguing paradox of Victorian cleanliness. While outer appearances might have been prim and proper and bathing infrequent, there was a strong emphasis on clean linen undergarments. It was considered a mark of respectability and personal fastidiousness to have fresh underlayers, even if the person inside them hadn't had a full bath in a week. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on clean linen was a genuine substitute for full body washing, or merely a pragmatic adaptation to the logistical challenges of bathing. It was likely a bit of both, a way to maintain a perceived standard of cleanliness without the constant effort of full ablutions. The material of choice was almost always linen or cotton because these natural fibers were absorbent, relatively easy to wash compared to wools and silks, and could withstand the harsh washing processes of the era, which often involved boiling water and strong lye soaps. Laundering these garments was a laborious task, as we'll discuss, often done by laundresses or domestic staff. But the very existence of these multiple layers of washable undergarments speaks volumes about the Victorian understanding of dirt and sweat. They knew that bodily excretions needed to be managed, and if you couldn't wash the body itself frequently, then at least you could change the fabric closest to it. So, beneath the stiff collars and voluminous skirts lay a hidden world of practical linen, working hard to keep the visible layers respectable. Having explored the hidden world of undergarments and their crucial role in trapping personal grime, let's now consider the visible layers. Outerwear enduring the grime. Today, you might toss a shirt in the wash after one wear, or dry clean a suit a few times a year. In the Victorian era, the relationship with outer clothing was entirely different, driven by expense, material, and the sheer effort involved in cleaning. Imagine your grandest Victorian frock coat, or a voluminous silk gown. These were often incredibly expensive garments, representing a significant investment for any household. They were also typically made from materials like heavy wool, silk, or complex weaves that were not designed for frequent washing. The dyes used could run, the intricate embellishments could be damaged, and the very structure of the garment could be ruined by immersion in water and vigorous scrubbing. So, instead of washing, other methods were employed to keep them presentable. It sounds quite challenging, doesn't it, to keep something clean that you can barely wash? Your outerwear might go for months, or even an entire season, without a proper cleaning. For everyday wear, dust and visible dirt would be removed by vigorous brushing. You'd see servants, or individuals themselves, meticulously brushing coats and dresses to flick away surface grime, lint, and the ubiquitous soot from the city air. This was a daily ritual, far more common than any wet cleaning. For more stubborn spots, localized spot cleaning might occur, using a damp cloth or a dab of a cleaning agent like benzene or fuller's earth, which was a kind of absorbent clay. The goal was simply to make the garment look clean on the surface. To freshen clothes, particularly woolens, airing out was a common practice. Garments would be hung outdoors on a clothesline on a windy day or near an open window to allow the air to circulate through them, theoretically dissipating odors and dust. Sometimes they might even be hung in a smokehouse or near burning incense to impart a more pleasant scent, attempting to mask the accumulation of stale body odor or environmental smells. This was a classic example of masking rather than truly cleansing, much like the perfumes we'll discuss soon. Historians still argue whether these airing methods were truly effective at anything beyond superficial deodorizing, but they were the best available option for preserving expensive garments. The dark colors prevalent in Victorian fashion, black navy, dark greens and browns, were also highly practical. They were excellent at hiding dirt and stains, making the infrequent cleaning less noticeable. While these colors were certainly influenced by mourning customs and broader aesthetic preferences, their utility in an era of pervasive grime cannot be overstated. So, while you might observe an impeccably dressed Victorian gentleman or lady, remember that beneath the brushed surface, their coats and dresses were often accumulating a considerable amount of unseen dirt and stale odors, patiently enduring the grime until a rare and arduous cleaning day arrived. Stepping further into the subtle arts of Victorian social presentation, we arrive at a significant coping mechanism for an era less accustomed to daily washing, masking odor. Perfumes rise. Today, perfume is a personal choice, a pleasant accessory. For Victorians, it often served a more fundamental purpose, to combat the inevitable personal aromas that pre-accumulated in a world of infrequent bathing and pervasive urban stench. Imagine a world where the air itself was often thick with unpleasant smells: coal, smoke, sewage, horse manure, and the faint but distinct odor of unwashed bodies. In such an environment, merely smelling clean was a challenge, let alone fragrant. While clean linen undergarments provided a foundational layer of freshness, and airing clothes helped. For a more immediate and noticeable impact, perfume became indispensable. It wasn't always about delicate floral notes. Sometimes it was about sheer potency to cut through the surrounding olfactory landscape. It's a bit like trying to enjoy a light dessert in a smoke-filled room. You need something strong to even register, don't you? Victorian perfumes were often richer, heavier, and more concentrated than many modern fragrances. Scents like rose, jasmine, violet, and patchouli were popular, along with more exotic notes for evening wear. These weren't merely dabbed on. They were often applied quite liberally to clothing, handkerchiefs, and sometimes directly to the skin, though sparingly due to the alcohol content which could be drying. A lady might carry a perfumed handkerchief, not just for elegance, but to discreetly hold to her nose when confronted with particularly offensive smells in the street or in crowded public spaces. Gentlemen, too, used colognes and scented hair. Pomades not only for personal adornment, but also as a subtle barrier against the surrounding grime. This rise in perfume usage wasn't just a matter of fashion. It was a pragmatic response to the realities of the era. If you couldn't reliably remove body odor through frequent bathing, you could at least mask it with something more pleasant. Historians still argue whether the Victorians genuinely believed perfume made them feel cleaner, or if they simply understood its social utility in creating a more agreeable personal aura. It was likely a combination of both, a psychological comfort and a social necessity. The burgeoning chemical industry of the Victorian era also contributed to the rise of perfumes, allowing for the creation of new synthetic fragrances and the mass production of existing ones, making them more accessible to a wider segment of society. Even if a full bath was a weekly or fortnightly event, a daily spritz of cologne or a dab of scented water could provide an immediate, if superficial, sense of freshness. So, while we might view Victorian society as prim and proper, remember that behind the stiff collars and voluminous skirts, there was often a strategic deployment of heavy scents, quietly but effectively battling the unseen battles of personal aroma in a constantly odorous world. Leaving the subtle, fragrant world of Victorian perfumes, let's now turn our attention to a truly revolutionary development in public hygiene, one that offered a beacon of cleanliness for the working classes. Public baths, a cleanliness revolution. Today, public swimming pools are commonplace, but their Victorian predecessors often served a far more fundamental and essential purpose, providing access to basic washing facilities. Imagine living in a cramped tenement without running water, or a private bathtub, and perhaps sharing a communal tap down the street. The idea of a proper, full body wash might seem like an impossible dream. This dire need led to the gradual emergence of public washhouses and baths, primarily aimed at providing affordable and accessible facilities for the working poor. The first public washhouse in the UK opened in Liverpool in 1842, and the Baths and Washhouses Act of 1846 encouraged their establishment across the country. It was a groundbreaking idea, wasn't it? A place where you could go just to get clean. These establishments were a far cry from modern spas. They were functional, often stark, but offered an invaluable service. You would pay a small fee, typically a penny or two, to gain access to a private cubicle containing a large tub, a supply of warm water, and a bar of soap. For many, this was their only opportunity for a truly thorough wash, a chance to immerse themselves in clean water and scrub away weeks of accumulated grime. Imagine the feeling of stepping into that warm water after a long, dirty week of labor. It must have felt like pure bliss, a true luxury. Beyond the individual bathing cubicles, many public baths also included washhouses. These were communal areas equipped with large tubs, scrubbing boards, and drying racks, where women, and it was predominantly women, could bring their families' laundry. This was a godsend for those living in tiny rooms with no space or adequate water supply for washing clothes. Here, they could share resources, gossip, and transform mountains of dirty linen into clean, fresh garments. It sounds like a noisy, bustling, communal affair, a hub of daily life and hygiene all rolled into one. The establishment of public baths and washhouses was a direct response to the growing awareness of public health issues and the link between cleanliness and disease, even if the precise mechanisms of germ theory were still being debated. Reformers, industrialists, and even some philanthropists saw these facilities as a crucial step towards improving the health, morale, and respectability of the working classes. Historians still argue about the exact impact these baths had on overall public health, but their symbolic importance as places where cleanliness was prioritized and made accessible was immense. They represented a tangible effort to uplift the sanitary conditions of the masses, moving beyond individual struggle to a collective, publicly supported solution for personal hygiene. These institutions were, in their own way, a quiet revolution in the fight against Victorian filth. From the communal solace of public baths, let's now turn to a more private, yet equally fundamental, aspect of Victorian sanitation. Early sanitation, the privy pit. Today, the flush toilet in your home is a given, a clean, efficient way to dispose of human waste. In the Victorian era, for the vast majority, the reality was far more basic, far smellier, and certainly far less hygienic. Imagine stepping into the backyard of a typical Victorian home, or a tenement block, and seeking out the toilet. You wouldn't find a small room with a porcelain bowl. Instead, you'd likely encounter a small, detached shed, often shared by multiple households. Inside, there would be a wooden seat with a hole under which lay a deep privy pit or cesspit. This was, quite simply, a hole in the ground designed to collect human excrement. Sometimes it would be lined with brick. Often it was just an unlined pit, allowing its contents to leach into the surrounding soil. It's a rather stark image, isn't it? A hole in the ground as your primary sanitary solution. These privy pits were emptied infrequently, perhaps once a year or even less, by nightmen or night soil men, whose job it was to shovel out the accumulated waste under the cover of darkness. The contents would then be carted away, often to be used as fertilizer in agricultural fields, a rather unsavory but common practice. The process of emptying these pits was, as you can imagine, incredibly foul-smelling and unpleasant, leaving a lingering stench for days. You might even find yourself holding your breath just imagining it. The design of these pits presented numerous hygiene challenges. They were a breeding ground for flies, which could then carry pathogens into homes. The overflowing or leaking pits contaminated the surrounding soil and, crucially, often seeped into nearby shallow wells, directly contaminating drinking water supplies. This direct link between human waste and waterborne diseases like cholera and typhus, though initially unrecognized due to the prevailing miasma theory, made the privy pit a major public health hazard. Historians still argue about the exact proportion of urban households that relied on privy pits versus other forms of waste disposal, but it was undoubtedly the dominant method for much of the era, especially among the working and lower middle classes. Even within homes, for nighttime use, chamber pots were ubiquitous. These ceramic or metal vessels would be kept under beds and then emptied, often by servants or the householders themselves, into the privy pit or, unfortunately, sometimes directly into the street or nearest drain. The practice of slop throwing from windows was not uncommon in the poorest, most crowded areas, adding to the pervasive filth of the streets. So, while the privy pit served a necessary function, it was a rudimentary, unhygienic, and constantly overflowing challenge that contributed significantly to the overall unsanitary conditions of Victorian urban life, making the very act of waste disposal a major public health concern. Moving from the crude realities of the privy pit, we now arrive at what became a truly transformative, albeit slow-burning, innovation in household sanitation, the flush toilet's slow conquest. Today, the water closet is a seamless, essential part of every modern home. In the Victorian era, it was a burgeoning technology, gradually making its way from the homes of the wealthy into wider use, fundamentally changing the way human waste was managed indoors. Imagine the early days of the flush toilet. It wasn't the sleek, efficient porcelain fixture, you know. Early designs, like those by Joseph Bramah in the late 18th century, were rudimentary. By the mid-19th century, improvements were being made. Thomas Crapper, though often mistakenly credited with inventing the toilet, was actually a successful sanitary engineer who popularized and refined existing designs, making them more practical and reliable. His innovations focused on aspects like the siphonic flush and the floating ballcock, improving efficiency and preventing leaks. It's a rather quiet revolution when you think about it, improving something so utterly essential yet often unglamorous. The adoption of the flush toilet, or water closet WC, was a gradual process, primarily limited to the wealthy initially. Installing a WC required not only the fixture itself, but also a reliable supply of running water to fill the cistern, and crucially, a connection to a sewer system for waste disposal. These were expensive infrastructure developments, well beyond the reach of most Victorians. For those who could afford it, having a WC indoors was a significant step up from the outdoor privy or the constant emptying of chamber pots. It offered unparalleled convenience and a degree of privacy that was revolutionary. However, these early flush toilets were not without their problems. They were often noisy, prone to blockages, and some early designs could even allow sewer gases to escape back into the house, contributing to the miasma problem, or so they thought. The absence of proper vent pipes meant that the S-bend or U-bend trap, designed to hold water and block gases, could easily be siphoned dry, allowing noxious fumes to enter the living space. You might chuckle at the thought of a toilet that actually made your house smell worse if not installed correctly. Historians still argue whether the initial reluctance to widely adopt flush toilets was more due to their cost and demands, or a lingering cultural discomfort with bringing such a function indoors. Despite the challenges, the sanitary benefits were undeniable, especially as sewer systems began to expand. As cities invested in massive public works like Joseph Bazalgette's London sewer system, which we'll explore further, the flush toilet became increasingly viable for a wider population. By the late Victorian era, it was becoming a standard feature in new middle-class homes. This slow conquest of the flush toilet marked a significant turning point in urban hygiene, shifting waste disposal from individual, often unhygienic, methods to a centralized, more effective system, laying the groundwork for the modern plumbing we take for granted. It's a testament to how fundamental technological advancements, even in the most mundane areas, can utterly transform daily life and public health. From the gradual adoption of the flush toilet, we now turn to the chilling, yet ultimately galvanizing, reality that drove so many sanitary reforms: disease, a hygiene wake-up call. In an era before antibiotics and widespread vaccination, epidemics were not just medical events. They were societal catastrophes that underscored, in the most brutal way possible, the deadly consequences of poor sanitation. Imagine the sudden, terrifying arrival of cholera. It would sweep through a city with astonishing speed, laying low rich and poor alike, though disproportionately devastating the overcrowded, unsanitary working-class districts. Its symptoms, severe diarrhea, vomiting, dehydration, were gruesome, and death could occur within hours. The fear it instilled was palpable, leading to widespread panic. Unlike many other illnesses, cholera's rapid onset and visible effects made it impossible to ignore. You'd see hastily dug graves, hear the mournful tolling of church bells, and feel the cold grip of dread as neighbors succumbed. It's a stark reminder of a time when illness was a truly terrifying, unpredictable force, isn't it? Makes you appreciate modern medicine, while initially attributed to miasma. As we've discussed, each major cholera outbreak chipped away at this theory. Dr. John Snow's famous work with the Broad Street pump, though initially met with skepticism, provided compelling, empirical evidence that the disease was linked to contaminated water, not just bad air. Similar patterns emerged with typhus and dysentery, both of which thrived in unsanitary conditions, overcrowded housing, and contaminated water supplies. These diseases were often referred to as filth diseases because their prevalence was so clearly tied to poor hygiene. The sheer scale of these epidemics forced governments and public bodies to finally take action. It wasn't just about altruism, it was about self-preservation. When diseases like cholera began to spread beyond the slums and into wealthier districts, affecting the influential and powerful, the urgency for reform became undeniable. The Great Stink of 1858 in London, caused by the putrefaction of the Thames, was another such wake-up call, directly prompting the construction of the monumental sewer system. Historians still argue whether public fear or scientific understanding was the primary driver for widespread sanitary reform. It seems that fear often provided the initial impetus, creating the political will for changes that scientific understanding then guided. These devastating epidemics served as a harsh but ultimately necessary lesson for Victorian society. They laid bare the critical connection between public health, sanitation, and individual well-being. Each outbreak, each wave of death, incrementally strengthened the argument for clean water, proper sewage disposal, and improved housing. The widespread suffering caused by these diseases, directly traceable to unsanitary conditions, became the most powerful argument for the systematic improvements in hygiene that would ultimately transform cities and save countless lives, paving the way for the healthier world we inhabit today. The memory of such widespread sickness truly was a potent, if tragic, hygiene wake-up call, as the devastating impact of waterborne diseases became impossible to ignore. Our journey through Victorian hygiene now leads us into a space where cleanliness was, quite literally, a matter of life and death. Medical practices, unseen filth. Today you expect a doctor to wash their hands, wear gloves, and use sterilized instruments. In the Victorian era, even as scientific understanding advanced, the reality inside operating theaters and sick rooms was, put it mildly, terrifyingly unhygienic. Imagine entering a surgical ward in a Victorian hospital. The air might be thick, with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale bandages, and perhaps a faint scent of carbolic acid as reforms slowly took hold. Doctors often wore their street clothes, perhaps a blood-stained apron considered a mark of experience, moving from one patient to another, or from dissecting a cadaver to performing surgery, all without washing their hands. Surgical instruments might be wiped clean, but true sterilization was not a widely understood or practiced concept. Sponges used to wipe blood during operations might simply be rinsed in a bucket of water and reused. It's enough to make you wince, isn't it? The thought of being operated on with instruments that were, by modern standards, absolutely teeming with bacteria. The prevailing miasma theory, remember, focused on bad air. So, while some efforts were made to ventilate hospitals, the concept of contact transmission of disease via unwashed hands or unsterilized tools was still fiercely debated or entirely dismissed by many. Puerperal fever, for instance, a deadly infection common in new mothers, was rampant in maternity wards, often spread by doctors who went directly from autopsies to delivering babies without any hand disinfection. It was a horrifying irony. The very people trying to heal were often, unknowingly, agents of infection. Historians still argue whether the medical establishment's initial resistance to germ theory was due to genuine scientific skepticism, professional pride, or simply a deep-seated reluctance to admit that their own practices might be causing so much harm. The groundbreaking work of Ignaz Semmelweis in the 1840s, who drastically reduced mortality rates in his maternity ward by insisting doctors wash their hands with chlorinated lime solution, was largely ignored or ridiculed by the medical community for decades. It took the powerful advocacy of figures like Joseph Lister in the 1860s, applying Pasteur's germ theory to surgical practice, for the concept of antisepsis to begin gaining traction. Lister's use of carbolic acid for sterilizing instruments and wounds dramatically reduced post-operative infections, slowly convincing a skeptical medical world that invisible germs, not miasma, were the enemy. However, the adoption of practices was slow and inconsistent. Even by the late Victorian era, while some hospitals and surgeons embraced the new ideas, many continued with older, unhygienic methods. The widespread practice of boiling instruments or using steam sterilization, which we consider basic today, only became truly universal well into the 20th century. So, while medical science was advancing, the actual implementation of hygienic practices in daily medical care lagged far behind, making a visit to the doctor or a stay in a hospital a far riskier proposition than we can possibly imagine today. The unseen filth in these critical environments truly underscored the deadly power of ignorance about microscopic life. Having explored the delicate balance of children's hygiene, our focus now shifts to the often unseen backbone of Victorian domestic cleanliness, servants, the invisible hands. Today, you might hire a cleaning service periodically, but in the Victorian era maintaining a clean home, especially for the middle and upper classes, relied almost entirely on a dedicated and often unhygienic workforce. Imagine a grand Victorian house, seemingly spotless, with polished furniture, clean floors, and crisp linens. This immaculate appearance was not achieved by magic. It was the result of the relentless, often thankless, labor of numerous domestic servants. From the scullery maid to the housemaid, the cook to the laundry maid, these individuals toiled from dawn until late at night, performing tasks that were arduous, repetitive, and frequently exposed them to the very filth their employers sought to avoid. It's a sobering thought, isn't it, that someone else's pristine home was built upon another's constant encounter with dirt. Consider the daily routine of a housemaid. She would be up before anyone else, lighting fires, emptying slops, chamber pots, and carrying heavy pails of water upstairs for the morning wash basin. Her day would be filled with sweeping, dusting, scrubbing floors, often on her hands and knees, polishing brass, and cleaning fireplaces, tasks that were inherently dirty and physically demanding. Laundry maids would spend long, hot days in steamy wash houses, hand-scrubbing mountains of linen using harsh soaps and boiling water, a process that was brutal on hands and lungs. Cooks, too, worked in kitchens that could be hot, greasy, and prone to vermin. Despite their efforts at cleanliness, the irony was that while servants created an illusion of cleanliness for their employers, their own living and working conditions were often far from hygienic. They typically lived in cramped, unventilated quarters, often in basements or attics, with limited access to private washing facilities. Their own personal hygiene might suffer simply due to exhaustion, lack of time, and inadequate resources. While they cleaned the family's clothes, their own uniforms might go for longer periods between washes, absorbing the grime of their daily labors. Historians still argue whether the class divide in hygiene was merely economic, or if it also reflected a social acceptance of different standards of cleanliness for different strata of society. It seems likely that the physical distance between the public rooms and the servants' quarters also helped maintain the illusion. These invisible hands were essential for upholding the Victorian ideal of the respectable home. They managed the refuse, battled the dust, and processed the endless piles of dirty laundry and chamber pot contents. Without their tireless, often low-paid, and frequently unhygienic labor, the seemingly pristine facade of Victorian upper and middle-class life would have crumbled, revealing the underlying grime that was a constant challenge of the era. The very cleanliness achieved by the masters was, in essence, transferred onto the bodies and living spaces of their servants. From the grim realities of Victorian medical practices, let's shift our focus to a perhaps more tender, yet equally challenging, aspect of hygiene: children's hygiene, delicate balances. Today, baby wipes, sterilizers, and frequent hand washing are cornerstones of childcare. In the Victorian era, the approach to keeping infants and children clean was a complex blend of traditional beliefs, practical limitations, and a slow-dawning awareness of germ transmission. Imagine trying to keep a baby clean in an era without disposable diapers, running hot water, or readily available antiseptic creams. Nappies' diapers were made of linen or cotton, and while changed frequently, they were washed by hand, often in cold water, and then reused. The constant dampness and lack of effective cleaning meant that diaper rash was rampant, often leading to painful sores and infections. For very young infants, there was often a belief that frequent bathing could be harmful, making them susceptible to colds or weakening their constitution. So, a quick daily wipe down was common, but a full bath for a baby might be a weekly, or even less frequent event, particularly in poorer households where warm water was a luxury. It's a sobering thought, isn't it, to consider how vulnerable little ones were to the pervasive grime. As children grew, their hygiene practices largely mirrored those of the adults around them, albeit with perhaps a bit more leniency for visible dirt. Children, especially those in working-class families, spent their days playing in the streets, which, as we've seen, were far from clean. Soot, dust, horse manure, and general refuse were their constant companions. Their clothes, often handmade, were worn for long periods between washes and were often caked with grime. Lice and fleas were incredibly common, a persistent nuisance that parents battled with fine-toothed combs and various home remedies, including the aforementioned vinegar, or even more pungent concoctions. You might observe children with perpetually grubby hands and faces, a direct result of their environment and the limited means of cleaning. However, there was also a strong social emphasis on presenting children as clean and respectable, especially for Sundays or special occasions. This meant Herculean efforts to scrub faces, comb hair, and put on the cleanest, though not necessarily clean clothes. This delicate balance between the aspiration for cleanliness and the harsh realities of the environment was a constant challenge for Victorian parents. Historians still argue whether the high infant mortality rates of the era were primarily due to infectious diseases stemming from poor hygiene or broader issues like malnutrition and inadequate medical care. It was undoubtedly a complex interplay of factors, with hygiene playing a significant, undeniable role. The awareness of children's vulnerability did slowly lead to some targeted reforms. Early proponents of child welfare pushed for better sanitation in orphanages and schools, and public health campaigns began to emphasize the importance of cleaner conditions for preventing childhood diseases. Yet, for many Victorian children, growing up meant navigating a world where illness was a constant threat, and true cleanliness remained an elusive ideal, a testament to the daily struggles faced by even the youngest members of society. As our journey through the grimy yet fascinating world of Victorian hygiene draws to a close, you can now truly appreciate the profound shift that occurred, leading directly to what we experience today. Our final contemplation brings us to the Victorian legacy, our clean present, the struggles, the epidemics, the pioneering reforms, and even the everyday ingenuity of Victorians laid the essential groundwork for the hygienic standards we now take for granted. Imagine your own bathroom. Today, the constant flow of clean, potable water from the tap, ready for your daily shower or bath. The array of specialized shampoos, soaps, and toothpastes, all promising cleanliness and freshness. The efficient flush toilet, whisking waste away to unseen, sophisticated sewer systems. The very air you breathe indoors, largely free from industrial soot and the pervasive stench of decay. This seamless, invisible infrastructure of cleanliness is a direct inheritance from the battles fought and the innovations forged in the 19th century. It's easy to look back at the Victorians and chuckle at their infrequent baths, their miasma theories, or their reliance on eggs for hair washing. But remember the context. They were living through an unprecedented period of urban growth and industrialization, grappling with challenges of scale and density that no society had faced before. They were, in many ways, figuring it out as they went along, often learning the hard way through devastating epidemics. Historians still argue whether the Victorians were truly dirty by choice, or simply constrained by the technology and understanding of their time. It's clear it was a combination, with pragmatism often triumphing over aspiration. The great public works, like London's immense sewer system, the establishment of regulated water supplies, and the gradual acceptance of germ theory, were monumental achievements. These weren't just engineering feats. They were triumphs of public health policy, driven by dedicated reformers and the collective, often painful, realization that disease respected no social boundaries. The fight for cleaner cities wasn't quick or easy. It was a century-long slog, marked by significant breakthroughs and frustrating setbacks. Even the everyday practices, from the layered underwear acting as protective barriers to the resourceful use of baking soda, speak to a deep-seated desire for cleanliness, even when the means were limited. The shift from masking odors to actually eliminating germs was a revolution in thought, influencing everything from personal care products to hospital procedures. So, as you drift off tonight, perhaps after a warm bath and brushing your teeth, take a moment to reflect on the Victorians, their struggles with dirt, disease, and the very definition of clean were the crucible in which our modern hygienic world was forged. We stand on the shoulders of their grimy, determined efforts. Now, as the echoes of Victorian streets fade into the quiet of your room, let your thoughts gently untangle from the layers of history. Feel the comfort of your clean sheets, the soft quiet of the modern night. The smells of the past, the distant cries of street vendors, and the tireless work of forgotten hands now recede into the long sleep of time. Allow your mind to clear, each breath becoming softer, slower. Let go of any lingering thoughts of bygone eras, and simply settle into the peaceful rhythm of the present moment. The journey through history is complete for tonight. The lessons learned, the stories told. Rest now, deeply and calmly. Sweet dreams.